The moving trucks rolled into Oakwood Estates on a perfect spring morning. Sunlight glinted off identical windows of nearly identical houses, each lawn precisely the same shade of green, each mailbox standing at attention like soldiers on parade. After 5 years in a cramped downtown apartment, this house represented everything I had worked for: 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and most importantly, a backyard of my very own. I carried the last box from the truck, pausing to wipe sweat from my forehead and admire my new home. The red brick exterior and white trim looked exactly like the listing photos that had captured my heart. The property was not large by suburban standards, but compared to apartment living, it felt like an estate. I set the box down on the front porch and took a deep breath of fresh suburban air. "Welcome to the neighborhood," a cheerful voice called from across the street. A middle-aged couple walked over, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I am David, and this is my wife, Susan. We live in the blue house across the way." Susan handed me the basket, which contained homemade cookies and a bottle of wine. "We thought you might need a little pick-me-up after moving day. It is always exhausting." "That is incredibly kind of you," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I am Alex. It is nice to meet neighbors so quickly." David glanced around briefly before leaning in slightly. "Just a heads up, Oakwood has a pretty active HOA. Nothing too serious, but they do like things done a certain way." Susan nodded, her smile still present but slightly strained. "You will get the welcome packet soon. Just follow the guidelines and everything will be fine." "The HOA president is quite detail-oriented," David added carefully. I nodded, not thinking much of it. Every HOA has rules. I am sure it will be fine. 3 days later, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a formal welcome letter topped with the Oakwood Estates logo, along with what could only be described as a small book of regulations. I flipped through pages of rules about everything from acceptable shades of exterior paint to the maximum height of garden gnomes. It seemed excessive, but manageable. I set it aside to read properly later. I spent the afternoon setting up my backyard, positioning the patio furniture I had eagerly purchased after years of dreaming about outdoor entertaining. The space was coming together nicely when a sharp voice interrupted my thoughts. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to a woman standing at the edge of my property. She was perhaps in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in pressed khakis and a light blue blouse. Her silver blonde hair was cut in a perfect bob, not a strand out of place. She clutched a clipboard and wore a name badge that read Margaret Wilson, HOA President. "Your garbage cans are visible from the street," she said, pointing toward the side of my house. Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that refuse containers must be stored out of sight except on collection days. "Oh, I am sorry," I replied, surprised by this introduction. "I am still getting settled. I will move them right away." Margaret nodded curtly. "Please do, and you should have received your welcome packet by now. I encourage you to read it thoroughly." Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Yes, I got it this morning. I will review it all." "Excellent. Compliance ensures our property values remain high. Welcome to Oakwood." She turned and walked away, making a note on her clipboard. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed Margaret standing at her window across the street and 2 houses down, watching my property. The curtain fell back into place when our eyes met. An uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. The next morning, I found a bright yellow notice tucked into my door frame. "Violation. Lawn exceeds maximum height of 3.25 inches. Please correct within 24 hours to avoid fines." I stared at my lawn in disbelief. I had only been in the house for 4 days. Later that week, I met Robert, my next-door neighbor, while retrieving my mail. When I mentioned the lawn violation, he grimaced sympathetically. "You met Margaret, huh? Word of advice, stay on her good side if you can. She has been running this HOA like a small dictatorship for years. Some people call her the clipboard queen behind her back." "Is she always this intense?" I asked. Robert lowered his voice. "Margaret has cited me for having wind chimes that exceeded the decibel limit. She measured them with an actual sound meter, and the Johnsons down the street fined because their holiday decorations stayed up 12 hours past the January 2nd deadline. A snowstorm had made it unsafe to remove them." As the days passed, more neighbors shared their Margaret stories. Each tale was more absurd than the last, painting a picture of a woman who wielded HOA rules like weapons. I began to understand the nervous glances and careful warnings. I had not just purchased a home, I had moved into Margaret's kingdom, and she did not appear to welcome new subjects. The first month in my new home passed quickly as I settled into suburban rhythms. Despite Margaret's watchful presence, I began forming connections with neighbors who had suffered under her reign. One evening, I hosted an impromptu gathering with Robert and his wife Claire, along with Susan and David from across the street. "So how long has Margaret been in charge?" I asked as we sat on my newly approved patio furniture. I had carefully measured its distance from property lines according to Section 22 of the bylaws. Claire sighed. 8 years now, no one runs against her anymore." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "If everyone dislikes how she runs things, why not vote her out?" David leaned forward. "The board is stacked with her friends. Her husband played golf with half of them before he passed, and she has kept those connections. The other half are too intimidated to challenge her. The annual meetings are scheduled at impossible times," Susan added. "Usually mid-afternoon on weekdays when most people cannot attend." Robert nodded. "And if you miss 3 meetings, you lose voting privileges for a year. Convenient system, right?" This conversation was interrupted by a knock at my door the next morning. It was Margaret, clipboard in hand. "Your bird feeder exceeds the maximum allowed height by 4 inches, she stated without greeting. "And those purple flowers in your front garden are not on the approved plant list." I blinked in surprise. "There is an approved plant list." "Page 42, Appendix C," she replied without hesitation. "You have until Friday to replace them with approved varieties. Documentation and photos will be required." Over the next 2 weeks, I received citations for a welcome mat that was 1 inch too wide, a garden hose that remained visible for more than 6 hours, and window blinds that were apparently the wrong shade of white. Each violation came with potential fines and deadlines for correction. I attempted to appeal the citations through the proper channels, scheduling a review with the HOA board. The meeting lasted exactly 7 minutes. Margaret presented her case with photographs and measurements, and the board members nodded along. My explanations and questions were met with polite but dismissive responses. The violations were unanimously upheld. That weekend, my brother James came to visit. As a police officer in the neighboring district, his schedule rarely allowed for social calls, so I was excited to show him my new home. We were in the front yard discussing plans for a vegetable garden when Margaret approached. "Excuse me," she called sharply from the sidewalk. "That garden hose is improperly stored again." I suppressed a sigh. "Good morning, Margaret. This is my brother James. James, this is Margaret Wilson, our HOA president." James smiled politely and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Margaret." She shook his hand briefly before returning to the issue. The hose needs to be completely out of sight when not in active use. It is clearly stated in the bylaws. I was just showing James where I plan to put a vegetable garden, I explained. We will put the hose away when we are finished. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Just ensure it is stored properly. And regarding vegetable gardens, they are only permitted in backyards, not visible from the street, and cannot exceed 48 square feet. James maintained his professional demeanor, though I could see his eyebrows raise slightly. Sounds like you run a tight ship here. Property values require vigilance, Margaret replied. Are you moving to the area as well? No, just visiting today, James said without mentioning his profession. I work nearby, though. After Margaret left, James turned to me with wide eyes. Wow, you were not exaggerating about her. That was actually a pleasant interaction by her standards, I replied. Usually there is a citation involved. James shook his head. I deal with all types in my job, but she is something special. Later that afternoon, as James helped me install some shelves, he suggested I needed to build community connections to balance Margaret's influence. People like that thrive when neighbors are isolated from each other, he observed. His advice resonated with me. The following week, I decided to plan a housewarming barbecue. It would be a perfect opportunity to meet more neighbors and create the sense of community James had mentioned. I created simple invitations and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. I hesitated before writing Margaret's name on an envelope, torn between courtesy and self-preservation. Ultimately, I decided inclusion was better than exclusion, even if it meant enduring her scrutiny during the event. As I placed Margaret's invitation in her mailbox, I noticed her watching from behind her front window. Our eyes met briefly before she let the curtain fall back into place. Something in her gaze suggested she interpreted my party not as a friendly gesture, but as a challenge to her authority. I walked home with an unsettling feeling that the simple act of hosting neighbors might become my biggest confrontation with Margaret yet. The following day, I found another yellow notice on my door. This one cited improper mailbox decoration. Apparently, the small butterfly sticker my young niece had placed there during her visit violated Section 19, Paragraph 7. I peeled off the sticker, wondering what other violations Margaret would find before my party. The invitation had clearly escalated our quiet conflict, and I was beginning to understand that in Margaret's eyes, community building was a threat to her control. With my party scheduled for Saturday afternoon, I spent a full evening reviewing the HOA rulebook, determined to ensure perfect compliance. I spread the documents across my dining room table, highlighting relevant sections about noise levels, guest parking, and outdoor gatherings. The regulations were extensive but not impossible to follow. I took photographs of my property from various angles, documenting the current state of my yard, the position of outdoor furniture, and the distance from property lines. I measured speaker placement for music, ensuring they would point away from neighboring properties and remain below the maximum allowed volume. I even created a parking map for guests to follow HOA-approved visitor spaces. My meticulous preparation caught the attention of my neighbors. Robert stopped by as I was measuring the distance between my grill and the property line. Planning a military operation, he joked, watching me mark measurements in a notebook. I laughed, just making sure Margaret cannot find any violations during the barbecue. Did you get the invitation? We did, and we are looking forward to it. Do you need any help with preparations? Robert offered. Actually, if you could bring some extra folding chairs, that would be great. Robert nodded. No problem. And just so you know, Susan and David are bringing their famous potato salad, and the Johnsons said they will bring dessert. People are excited about this. It has been a while since anyone dared to host a neighborhood gathering. Over the next few days, other neighbors offered assistance, everything from lending serving platters to helping set up tables. The community support was encouraging, but I could not ignore Margaret's increasing surveillance. 3 days before the party, I spotted her walking slowly past my house, taking photos with her phone. Later that afternoon, she repeated the process from a different angle. By Thursday, her documentation efforts had become blatant, standing directly across the street with her camera pointed at my property. Friday morning, I found an official-looking envelope tucked into my door. Inside was a printed notice that left my stomach in knots. Attention homeowner. Please be advised that according to newly implemented HOA Regulation 34.7, all gatherings exceeding 10 persons require board approval with a minimum 30-day advance notice. Your planned event for Saturday, May 15th, has not received proper authorization and must be canceled or rescheduled following proper procedures. I stared at the document in disbelief. This rule had not been in the original welcome packet. I immediately pulled out my copy of the bylaws and searched for the referenced regulation. After 30 minutes of careful review, I found nothing about a 30-day approval requirement for gatherings. I called Robert, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 5 years. Have you ever heard of Regulation 34.7 about party approvals? No, he replied after a moment of thought. That is definitely not in the original bylaws. When did you get this notice? This morning. The party is tomorrow. The timing seems suspiciously convenient. Robert was quiet for a moment. You should talk to Bill Henderson. He is a retired attorney who lives on Maple Court. He has challenged Margaret on proper bylaw procedures before. That afternoon, I walked over to Bill Henderson's house, a well-maintained colonial with tasteful landscaping. Bill was in his 70s, with a sharp mind and an even sharper distaste for HOA overreach. When I showed him the notice, he adjusted his reading glasses and studied it carefully. This is not properly ratified, he said finally. New regulations require a formal vote at an official meeting with proper notice to all homeowners. They cannot be added unilaterally by the board or the president. This appears to be backdated. Notice the revision date at the bottom. That is only 3 days ago, yet they claim this is an established rule. So the rule is not valid. Bill shook his head. Not legally enforceable, no. Margaret is likely counting on you not knowing the proper procedures. Most people just comply rather than challenge her. Relief washed over me. Thank you. I was worried I would have to cancel. Do not cancel, Bill advised. But document everything. Take photos, save this notice, and record any interactions. If she escalates, you will want evidence. That evening, I called James to update him on the situation. Margaret is trying to shut down my party before it even happens, I explained. That is ridiculous, James replied. What are you going to do? I am going forward with it. A retired attorney in the neighborhood confirmed the new rule is not valid. Good, I will definitely be there tomorrow, and not just for the free food, James said. Consider me your unofficial security detail. Thanks, I have a feeling I might need backup. As we ended the call, I noticed movement across the street. Margaret was on her phone, packing in front of her living room window. Through the glass, I could see her gesturing emphatically, clipboard visible on the table beside her. She was rallying her allies, preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. A sense of dread mixed with determination settled over me as I continued my preparations. The party had transformed from a simple gathering into something much more significant, a test of wills between Margaret's control and the neighborhood's desire for community. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures in the mid-70s. It was as if nature itself had decided to support my defiance of Margaret's arbitrary rules. I rose early, checked my compliance checklist one final time, and began transforming my backyard. I positioned tables exactly 8 feet from property lines as required. I set up the sound system with speakers at the board-approved angle and tested the volume with an actual decibel meter borrowed from Bill Henderson. Every element was precisely placed according to regulations. The grill the required 10 feet from structures, waste receptacles discreetly positioned but easily accessible, and parking instructions posted near the front door. Robert and Claire arrived early to help with final preparations. "Margaret has been on her phone all morning," Claire reported as she arranged platters on the buffet table. "She was standing in her driveway for almost an hour, talking and pointing toward your house." "Let her plot," Robert said, helping me set up the final chairs. "Everything here is by the book. I have never seen such a rule-compliant party in my life." By 2 o'clock, guests began arriving. The Johnsons brought homemade pies. The Williams family carried in a cooler of drinks. Susan and David appeared with their famous potato salad and a bottle of wine. Bill Henderson came with his wife, carrying a folder that I suspected contained legal references in case Margaret made her move. One by one, neighbors I had barely met filled my backyard, introducing themselves and thanking me for organizing the gathering. The atmosphere quickly became festive. Conversations flowed, music played at the precise legal volume, and the aroma of grilling burgers filled the air. For the first time since moving in, I felt a genuine sense of community forming around me. Neighbors who had been isolated by Margaret's divide-and-conquer tactics were connecting, exchanging phone numbers, and making plans for future get-togethers. From my position near the grill, I had a clear view of Margaret's house. She emerged at precisely 2:30, dressed as if attending a formal business meeting rather than a neighborhood barbecue. She stood at the edge of her property, taking photos and making notes on her ever-present clipboard. Though invited, she made no move to join the celebration. James arrived around 3, casually dressed in jeans and a polo shirt, no hint of his profession visible. He greeted me with a hug. "Quite a turnout. Looks like the whole neighborhood is here." "Almost," I replied, nodding discreetly toward Margaret's surveillance position. "Except for our neighborhood watchdog." James followed my gaze. "Has she made any moves yet?" "Just documentation so far. I am sure that will change." I was right. As the party reached its peak around 4 o'clock, with about 30 neighbors enjoying food and conversation, Margaret finally made her approach. Conversations quieted as she walked purposefully across the lawn, clipboard extended like a shield. The music seemed to fade on its own as attention shifted to the impending confrontation. "Excuse me," Margaret announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I need to address several violations occurring at this unauthorized gathering." I stepped forward, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Hello, Margaret. Would you like a burger or some potato salad before we discuss any concerns?" She ignored my offer. "Your music exceeds the 55 decibel limit permitted by HOA regulations. I have measured it at 57 decibels from the property line." I smiled and gestured to the decibel meter visibly displayed on a nearby table, its digital readout clearly showing 53.4. "I have been monitoring it continuously. As you can see, we are within limits." Margaret's eyes narrowed at the meter. Without acknowledging it, she shifted tactics. There are also parking violations. Section 27 clearly states that guest vehicles cannot block sidewalks or be parked directly across from another vehicle on the street. All guests received parking instructions upon arrival, I replied, retrieving a copy of the map I had distributed. Every car is parked in compliance with HOA regulations. I could see frustration building in Margaret's expression as her usual tactics failed. The neighbors had fallen silent, watching our exchange with undisguised interest. Some had subtle smiles, enjoying seeing Margaret's authority challenged so politely yet effectively. "This gathering exceeds the 10-person limit without proper board approval," she stated, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. Bill Henderson stepped forward. "As I explained to our host yesterday, that regulation was not properly ratified according to HOA Bylaws Section 4, Paragraph 2, which requires proper notice and voting procedures for all new regulations. The document distributed yesterday cannot be legally enforced." Margaret's face flushed. She was losing ground in front of the very people she had intimidated for years. I almost felt sorry for her until her next statement. "This is unacceptable," she declared, raising her voice. "I have already called the police to address these violations. They should be arriving shortly to shut down this unauthorized event." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Several neighbors looked worried. Some began gathering their belongings, preparing to leave. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly. "Margaret," I said calmly, "that was unnecessary. We could have discussed any concerns without involving law enforcement." "Rules must be enforced," she replied, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Perhaps next time you will follow proper procedures." As if on cue, the sound of a police cruiser turning onto our street silenced all conversation. Red and blue lights flashed, reflecting off windows and faces. Margaret straightened her posture, adjusting her grip on her clipboard as she prepared to present her case to the arriving officer. The moment of confrontation had arrived, but not in the way Margaret expected. The police cruiser parked at the curb, its lights creating a blue and red strobe effect across the gathered faces. Conversations had completely stopped. The only sounds were the quiet music still playing at its regulation volume, and the car door opening with a distinct metallic click. Margaret moved immediately toward the vehicle, clipboard raised like a conductor's baton. I followed at a respectful distance, stomach tight with anxiety despite knowing we had violated no legitimate rules. The other neighbors hung back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, sunglasses concealing his eyes, his posture professional and authoritative. Margaret reached him first, practically vibrating with vindication. "Officer, thank you for responding so promptly," she began. "I am Margaret Wilson, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowner Association. This gathering is in violation of multiple HOA regulations, including noise ordinances, parking restrictions, and our gathering size limitation. The homeowner was properly notified that this event lacks required board approval." The officer listened without interruption, his expression unreadable behind the reflective sunglasses. When Margaret finished her recitation, he reached up and removed his sunglasses in one smooth motion. "Good afternoon, Ms. Wilson. I believe we met briefly last weekend. I am Officer James Mitchell." The effect was immediate and electric. Margaret's expression transformed from smug certainty to shocked recognition. Her eyes darted between James and me as understanding dawned. A collective murmur rippled through the watching neighbors as they processed what was happening. You are," Margaret stammered, her clipboard lowering slightly. I am the homeowner's brother, yes, James confirmed professionally. However, I assure you that has no bearing on how I will address any legitimate violations. Now, what specific city ordinances do you believe are being violated today? Margaret quickly recovered her composure. The noise level exceeds HOA limits. There are parking violations, and gatherings of this size require pre-approval by the board with 30 days' notice. James nodded. I understand those are HOA concerns. However, police can only enforce city ordinances and laws, not HOA regulations. Those are civil matters. But since I am here, I would be happy to check for any actual ordinance violations. Margaret's face flushed deeper. The noise is disturbing the peace. I will certainly check that, James replied. He walked toward the backyard, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the extraordinary circumstances. Margaret followed closely, clearly determined not to lose control of the situation. James approached the decibel meter on display and observed the reading, which still showed well under the city limit. He made a note in his official pad. The current noise level is within city ordinance limits, he stated. City code permits up to 65 decibels during daylight hours in residential areas. This gathering is measuring at approximately 53 decibels. He moved methodically through the backyard, checking various aspects of the setup. The grill is properly positioned relative to structures according to fire code. Walkways are clear for emergency access. Parking on the street appears to be in compliance with city regulations. With each confirmation of compliance, Margaret's expression grew more pinched. The neighbors had begun to gather closer, no longer afraid of the confrontation but invested in its outcome. Officer, this gathering exceeds the HOA-approved limit without proper authorization, Margaret insisted, her voice taking on a slight edge of desperation. James turned to her with polite professionalism. Ms. Wilson, as I mentioned, HOA regulations are not enforceable by law enforcement unless they coincide with city ordinances. I see no violations of city code here. This appears to be a peaceful neighborhood gathering within all legal parameters. Margaret's clipboard came up again like a shield. I want to speak to your supervisor. This is clearly a conflict of interest. You cannot objectively assess a situation involving your brother. You are absolutely within your rights to request that, James replied without hesitation. He reached into his pocket and produced a business card. Here is my badge number and my supervisor's contact information. You can file a formal complaint if you feel I have not performed my duties professionally. He handed her the card, which she took with visibly trembling fingers. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Where moments before Margaret had been the authority figure calling for enforcement, she now found herself without support, her tactics exposed in front of the very neighbors she had intimidated for years. I will be filing a complaint, she stated. This is completely inappropriate. That is your right, James responded evenly. Now, unless there are actual city ordinance violations you would like to report, I will be clearing this call. Margaret stood rigid for a moment, looking around at the gathered neighbors. What she saw seemed to unsettle her further, not fear or deference, but unified resistance. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly toward her house, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. As she retreated, the silent tension broke. Someone near the back of the crowd began to applaud, and others quickly joined in. It was not celebration of Margaret's humiliation, but relief at the lifting of an oppressive presence. James turned to me with a subtle smile. Everything appears to be in order here. Enjoy your gathering. "Thank you, officer," I replied, maintaining the professional facade despite wanting to hug my brother. As James returned to his cruiser, the party atmosphere restored itself with renewed energy. Conversations resumed at a more animated volume, though still within regulations. Neighbors who had been about to leave returned to the gathering, placing their belongings back on tables. Bill Henderson approached me with a wide smile. That was the most satisfying thing I have witnessed in 8 years of living here. Robert joined us, shaking his head in amazement. "Did you see her face when he took off those sunglasses? Priceless." "I had no idea your brother was a police officer," Susan added, eyes wide. "Talk about perfect timing." As the afternoon continued, a new conversation thread emerged among the guests. Neighbors began sharing their own Margaret stories openly, without the hushed tones and fearful glances that had accompanied such discussions before. Each tale of arbitrary enforcement and intimidation built upon the last, creating a shared narrative of community suppression. "She cited me for wind chimes," David recounted to an attentive group. "Said they exceeded the allowable decibel level. Who measures wind chimes?" "My children's chalk drawings on our own driveway got us a violation notice," another neighbor added. "Apparently, sidewalk chalk is considered graffiti, according to Margaret's interpretation." Story after story emerged, each more ridiculous than the last. What became clear was not just Margaret's zealous enforcement, but her selective application of the rules. Certain homeowners, primarily those on the board or in her social circle, received warnings where others received immediate fines. Some violations were ignored completely for favored residents. As I moved through my backyard, refilling drinks and collecting empty plates, I realized something significant had changed. Margaret's power had always relied on isolation, neighbors afraid to compare notes or stand together. Today had shattered that isolation. In bringing them together, I had inadvertently created the space for a collective reckoning. The party continued well into the evening, no longer just a housewarming, but something more meaningful. The first gathering of what felt like a community ready to reclaim its neighborhood from Margaret's iron grip. The aftermath of the party unfolded rapidly. Monday morning brought an official-looking envelope containing a notice of multiple HOA violations and a fine totaling $750. The document cited unauthorized gathering size, noise violations, and creating neighborhood discord. A separate paragraph mentioned potential property liens if the fine remained unpaid after 30 days. I was reviewing this notice when my phone rang. It was James. "Margaret filed a formal complaint against me," he said without preamble. "She accused me of professional misconduct and conflict of interest." "Are you in trouble?" I asked, immediately concerned. "Not at all. My supervisor reviewed the body camera footage this morning. Everything was by the book. I assessed the situation professionally and found no ordinance violations. The case is closed." Relief washed over me. "That is good to hear. I just received a notice of fines from the HOA." "I figured that was coming. What is your next move?" Before I could answer, my doorbell rang. Robert stood on my porch with Susan and David behind him. "We heard about the fine," Robert said. "We want to help." Over the next few hours, my living room became an impromptu command center. Neighbors arrived in a steady stream, each with stories of their encounters with Margaret and offers of support. Bill Henderson reviewed my fine notice with a professional eye. "This is highly questionable," he said, adjusting his reading glasses. "The HOA can only enforce properly ratified rules. The gathering size limitation was never legally added to the bylaws." We all saw how she acted at the party, Susan added. It was embarrassing. By evening, 10 neighbors had provided written statements describing Margaret's behavior and confirming that my party had complied with all legitimate regulations. Bill helped draft a formal appeal letter citing specific bylaw sections and procedural violations in the enforcement process. This is bigger than just your fine, Bill explained as he worked. Margaret has been selectively enforcing rules for years, applying them strictly to some while ignoring violations by her allies. That is a violation of the HOA Charter, which requires equal application of all rules. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. Every morning, I found new neighbors on my doorstep offering support. Some brought documentation of their own experiences, photos of identical violations treated differently, copies of disputed fines, records of denied appeals. Bill organized everything into a comprehensive case file, building evidence of a years-long pattern of selective enforcement. Meanwhile, Margaret escalated her campaign. Additional violation notices appeared on my door for a barely visible water hose, for bird droppings on my driveway, for wind-blown leaves not promptly removed. Each came with additional fines. She was clearly trying to drown me in paperwork and penalties. What Margaret failed to recognize was how her actions were affecting the neighborhood dynamic. Each new citation, each retaliatory measure, pushed more homeowners to join our growing coalition. Even previously, neutral residents began to show support after witnessing her obvious targeting of my property. 2 weeks after the party, we discovered something significant. Claire, who worked at the county records office, found that several board members had failed to file proper conflict of interest disclosures despite having business relationships with service providers hired by the HOA. This represented a serious violation of both HOA bylaws and potentially state regulations governing homeowner associations. Armed with this information, Bill helped draft a petition calling for a special board meeting to address concerns about governance. According to the bylaws, such a meeting could be forced with signatures from 25% of homeowners. We collected twice that number in 3 days. Board members began to notice the shifting landscape. 2 called me privately, distancing themselves from Margaret's enforcement actions and claiming they had been misled about certain situations. Another resigned from the board entirely, citing personal reasons but hinting at discomfort with recent decisions. The special board meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the community center. When I arrived 30 minutes early to prepare, the parking lot was already filling with homeowners. Inside, chairs normally arranged in rows for the sparsely attended regular meetings had been supplemented with extras to accommodate the unprecedented turnout. Margaret arrived precisely on time, her usual confidence visibly shaken by the crowd. The remaining board members flanked her at the front table, their expressions ranging from nervous to resigned. After calling the meeting to order, the board secretary announced that, due to the unusual attendance, comments would be limited to 2 minutes per person. I was called first, as the homeowner who had triggered the special session. I approached the microphone with a folder of evidence organized by Bill. Good evening. I am not here to dispute a single fine or violation. I am here because our community deserves fair and transparent governance. For the next 2 minutes, I outlined the pattern of selective enforcement, the procedural violations and rule changes, and the documentation we had gathered. I concluded by requesting a formal review of all outstanding violations and the enforcement practices of the current administration. When I finished, something unexpected happened. The room erupted in applause. As I returned to my seat, Robert squeezed my shoulder in support. One by one, neighbors approached the microphone. Each shared their own experiences, reasonable requests denied, arbitrary fines imposed, selective enforcement witnessed. The board members listened with growing discomfort as the pattern became undeniable. Bill Henderson delivered the most damaging testimony, speaking with the measured precision of an attorney. As a retired legal professional, I must inform the board that the current enforcement practices expose the HOA to significant liability. Selective enforcement violates both your charter and state regulations governing homeowner associations. He presented documentation of identical infractions treated differently based on who committed them. Here we have two homeowners with bird feeders of identical height. One received 3 violation notices and $350 in fines. The other received no citation, despite photographic evidence the board was aware of both. The difference: the homeowner who was fined had previously questioned board decisions. The one who was not fined plays golf with board member Phillips. Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his seat as murmurs spread through the audience. After nearly 2 hours of testimony, the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her clipboard conspicuously absent. The vice president of the board, a man named Thomas who had rarely spoken at previous meetings, finally cleared his throat. In light of tonight's testimony, I move that we suspend all pending violation notices until a complete review can be conducted by an independent committee of homeowners, not currently serving on the board. Another board member quickly seconded the motion. When the vote was called, only Margaret opposed it. The motion passed 4-1. Thomas continued, "I further move that we schedule a special election for board positions within 30 days, as provided for in Section 8 of our charter under extraordinary circumstances." Again, the motion passed despite Margaret's opposition. As the meeting adjourned, homeowners lingered in excited conversation. Margaret exited quickly through a side door, avoiding the crowd entirely. In the parking lot, neighbors gathered around me in celebration. "This is just the beginning," Bill said. "The real work starts now." He was right. Over the next month, our community transformed. Regular meetings in different homes kept the momentum going. Committees formed to review the bylaws, examine financial records, and prepare for the upcoming election. What had begun as resistance to a single instance of overreach had become a movement to reclaim our neighborhood. Margaret did not surrender easily. She campaigned aggressively to maintain her position, suddenly becoming visible in parts of the neighborhood she had previously only monitored from a distance. She made promises of reform, of more reasonable enforcement, of transparency. Few believed her. The night before the special election, Robert and Susan organized a neighborhood potluck. As we gathered in Robert's backyard, all in compliance with the actual HOA regulations, I realized how far we had come. Neighbors who had barely spoken now knew each other's names and stories. A community had formed from what had once been isolated households under Margaret's thumb. "You should run for the board," Susan said as we helped clean up after the gathering. "You started all this." I had not considered the possibility, but as others joined the conversation, adding their encouragement, I realized they were right. If change was going to last, someone needed to help guide it. Perhaps that someone was me. The day of the special election arrived 6 weeks after my fateful backyard party. The community center buzzed with activity as homeowners arrived to cast their votes. The turnout was unlike anything Oakwood Estates had seen before. Nearly 85% of eligible households participated, compared to the typical 20% at regular meetings. Margaret arrived dressed formally, as if attending a business presentation rather than a neighborhood election. She had submitted a detailed platform document outlining her vision for continued stability with enhanced communication. Few bothered to read it. I had been persuaded to run for a board position, though not as president. My simple platform, fair enforcement, transparent governance, and community building, resonated with neighbors who had lived too long under arbitrary rule. 4 board positions were being contested, including the presidency. Margaret faced 2 challengers for her seat, Bill Henderson and a younger homeowner named Michelle, who had been particularly vocal about the need for change. I ran for a general board position against 2 of Margaret's longtime allies. The voting process took over 2 hours as each homeowner checked in, received a ballot, and made their choices. The current board secretary and an independent volunteer counted the votes publicly, displaying results on a projector screen. When the final tallies appeared, the room erupted in applause. Margaret had received only 17 votes out of 142 cast. Michelle, the young challenger, won the presidency with 94 votes. Bill took the vice presidency unopposed after the other candidate withdrew. I was elected to the board with the highest vote total of any candidate, 127 votes. The 4th position went to Robert, completing the transformation of leadership. Margaret did not wait for the celebration that followed. She collected her campaign materials and left without congratulating the winners, her face a mask of barely contained fury. It was the last time many of us would see her at a community gathering. The new board's first official meeting took place the following week. Our initial agenda item was addressing the backlog of violation notices issued during Margaret's final weeks as president. After reviewing each case, we voted unanimously to dismiss all pending citations that did not impact safety or property values. "This represents a fresh start," Michelle announced to the assembled homeowners. "Going forward, enforcement will be consistent, transparent, and focused on maintaining our community standards without micromanagement." Over the next 3 months, we reviewed and revised the HOA bylaws. The excessively detailed regulations, like the precise shade of white permitted for window blinds or the maximum height of garden gnomes, were replaced with more reasonable guidelines. Rules necessary for maintaining property values remained, but the subjective and arbitrary restrictions were eliminated. I suggested a rotating leadership model for future boards, where the presidency would change hands annually to prevent any single person from accumulating excessive influence. The proposal passed with overwhelming support from homeowners. Margaret retreated from community involvement entirely. She declined invitations to join committees or participate in neighborhood events. 6 months after the election, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her house. Within weeks, she had moved to a gated community in another county. The day Margaret's moving truck pulled away, a spontaneous gathering formed in Susan and David's driveway. It was not a celebration of her departure, but an acknowledgement of our community's transformation. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now greeted each other by name. Children played together across property lines without fear of citation. Gardens displayed a variety of flowers, some definitely not on Margaret's approved list. 1 year after my backyard party that had sparked the revolution, I hosted an anniversary celebration. Unlike the first gathering, this one required no decibel meters or compliance documentation. More than 50 neighbors attended, including several who had moved in after Margaret's departure and knew her only through neighborhood legends. As twilight fell and string lights illuminated my backyard, James arrived in civilian clothes, greeted warmly by neighbors who now knew him as my brother rather than the officer who had witnessed Margaret's downfall. "Look what you started," he said, gesturing to the gathering, "all because you refused to be intimidated." "It was not just me," I replied. "It was everyone who had reached their breaking point. We just needed a catalyst." Bill Henderson raised his glass in a toast, "To good neighbors and reasonable rules." The response was enthusiastic, "To good neighbors." As the party continued into the evening, I took a moment to appreciate how much had changed. Property values had actually increased under the new leadership, contradicting Margaret's dire predictions of decline without strict enforcement. More importantly, Oakwood Estates had transformed from a collection of houses into a genuine community. The annual backyard party became a neighborhood tradition. Each year, we gathered to celebrate not just the victory over Margaret's reign, but the continuing evolution of our community. New families moved in, attracted by the neighborhood's reputation for being welcoming while maintaining high standards. Board positions rotated as planned, preventing any single vision from dominating. The rulebook that once consumed an entire binder had been condensed to 10 pages of reasonable guidelines. The thick stack of violation notices that had once filled my counter was replaced by community newsletters announcing block parties, volunteer opportunities, and neighborhood improvements. Sometimes, during these gatherings, someone would share a Margaret story with newer residents, tales of measuring grass with rulers, or documenting the precise angle of garbage cans. These stories now brought laughter rather than anxiety, transformed from oppressive experiences into neighborhood folklore. In the end, the legacy of Margaret's reign was not the perfect lawns or identical mailboxes she had so rigorously enforced. It was the lesson that community requires balanced standards without strangling rules, governance without tyranny, and neighbors who see each other as people rather than potential violations. As I looked around at my backyard filled with friends who had once been strangers, I realized that Margaret had inadvertently given us a precious gift. In uniting to oppose her overreach, we had discovered something far more valuable than property values. We had found our voice, our community, and our home.